Greetings, everyone. We are recording on Saturday, May 22nd, 2021, and I am your host, Sean. Joining me today are co-hosts Zach.
Hello, everyone.
And Rob.
What's up?
You're listening to episode 4 of the 4 for 4 podcast. This is a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive on 4 select shows from the current anime season and discuss them in 4-episode batches week by week. This week, on our 4th and final show we're covering for the spring season, we'll be discussing episodes 1 through 4 of the original anime series, Odd Taxi. But before that, we have some pretty important discussions this week, both from a housekeeping perspective and a very important bit of news that happened that's kind of been reverberating throughout the anime community. So the first thing I'd like to discuss this week is the passing of Kentaro Miura, who is most well known for being the author of Berserk. So unfortunately, he died at the very young age of 54 due to heart complications, leaving in his wake the 32-year epic in progress. So before we get into the discussion for Odd Taxi this week, I felt we owed it both to the audience and ourselves just a brief discussion and just kind of a remembrance of Kentaro Miura and what he means to you guys. So let's start with you, Zach. What did Kentaro Miura mean to you?
Quite a lot, actually. You and your brothers actually first introduced me to Berserk. I had gotten into it my senior year of high school, and I remember going through the beginning, like throughout the entire Golden Age arc in a span of, I think, just 2 months. So, I mean, I had really binged the series when I first got into it. It was very impactful in a way that I can't say about many other manga. It sticks out and like stands apart on its own very well. It's a series I hold in very high regard, and I may not bring it up as like my favorite manga of all time, but anytime I have a discussion of like those that are among my favorites, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Berserk. Because now, with that being said, I haven't finished it and gotten caught up to it at this point. I'm still halfway through the Conviction arc, but I can say beyond a shadow of a doubt, it has some of the most intense and memorable scenes of any manga that like I've ever read. It's irreplaceable to me in my heart. Like nothing is quite the same like it. What about you, Rob?
Well, again, like Sean was the person that really kind of pushed me to actually getting into the manga. My prior knowledge to Berserk with Kentaro was like the Golden Age arc movies. Well, specifically the first movie, where I was like, well, okay. I mean, I've heard of Berserk before, but like this kind of slaps. I'm really about this. So I ended up picking up the first 3 volumes, and something that stands out about Kentaro being a mangaka is his impeccable line work, his attention to detail, and it only improved since his first run back in the late 80s. And I just can't believe that we have lost such a talented mangaka. I really have no words for the loss. So very, very influential. I don't think that we'll ever have anything that is kind of like grim dark as Kentaro's mangaka or mangaka.
It's all good.
Mangaka. Sorry. We'll never have any sort of manga or even anime that is going to be grim dark without just being like grim dark to be edgy or anything like that. So yeah, I'd just like to kind of take a moment of silence for Kentaro.
Yeah, and speaking to that, and that was actually going to touch on one of the big things I wanted to say about Kentaro Miura and Berserk. Yeah, as you both said, this is one of the series that I most fervently, I guess I want to say, evangelize to you, because really I think this is a property that it's one of the very few things that just about anyone needs to read. Watch, that's debatable. the various adaptions are pretty hit and miss. I love the original TV anime adaptation. The movies are mixed bag, but overall I'd still say they're quite good. The ones from 4C, but I mean, we all know, but well, most of us probably know about the infamous attempt
2016.
Yeah, some things better left unsaid. But really, Berserk is just so foundational to so many pieces of media, both in anime and otherwise, since it came out in 1989.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to call it like one of the most influential dark fantasy stories, really, that like to this present day, I would say.
Definitely. And when I think of the best in my mind, it always immediately goes up to comparison against Berserk, because really, as a manga or anything really in the manga anime medium, Berserk is my favorite. It's my absolute all-time favorite manga at the very least. Anime, I wouldn't put any of the anime up really that high, but in terms of manga, in my opinion, it's peerless. On top of being an exquisitely written story with one of, if not perhaps the best protagonists in all of manga, at least in my opinion, you can just find dozens and dozens and dozens of panels that belong in an art museum.
And for sure.
And really, that just only becomes more true the longer it goes on. And even in recent years, I'm a couple years behind on the manga to where he left off, but it was jaw-droppingly gorgeous and amazing all the way to the very end. And I cannot strongly enough recommend the manga to really anyone. I mean, especially early on, the imagery is intense. It does deal in extremely intense subject matter and all that entails. You can probably imagine what that would mean in a dark fantasy setting. But to Miura's credit, he really gives it much more care and nuance than just about, I mean, most authors would. And especially at the time in the late 80s, early 90s, when really his work is most rampant with that imagery. He does it really well. It's not to say there's not some parts that are probably a bit questionable or problematic, but especially later on, I think he always gets better at portraying that. And you mentioned grimdark, Rob, and I don't want to spend too long on this, but with Berserk, many people have the idea in their mind that, oh man, it's just this metal as fuck, grimdark, heavy metal, like corpses everywhere, blood and guts. But really, that's selling Berserk criminally short. The emotional nuance he gives his characters, again, I've said this a few times already, but it's second to none. Guts is an extremely nuanced protagonist who displays a full spectrum of emotions from very early on, I might add. And you both mentioned the Golden Age arc. The Golden Age arc is constantly cited as being the best arc in Berserk. And overall, I would agree. But really, I don't think it works as well as it does without what comes after. Because,
and I would agree with that.
Because really, what comes after recontextualizes what he goes through at the end of the Golden Age arc, and minor spoilers, but the Eclipse. I'm just going to say the Eclipse. It's the most pivotal scene in all of Berserk. It changes everything from that point forward. And Guts is in an extremely dark place after that. And it is extremely grim. But this is what I truly love about Berserk. Despite being faced with the most overwhelming despair, seeing tragedy after tragedy in his life, and losing everything over and over again, he still has the capacity to love and ultimately let himself be vulnerable again, even after the absolute worst that could happen to him. And really, that becomes only more true the more the story goes on. So to those who kind of brush aside Berserk as being this excessive grimdark story that's just trying to be grimdark for its own sake, it really is not that.
So that's not really the picture that I'm trying to paint for Berserk. Like it's not all grimdark, as obviously you explained. I've only literally read the first 3 volumes of Berserk, and I'm not saying like even within those first 3 volumes it's all grimdark. There's some still moments of levity and everything like that, and character development. It's just that it sets itself apart from other mangas because of the way that it's not afraid to shy away from any of the blood, gore, or anything. And it's very reminiscent to, like, you know, Games Workshop stuff.
So, and I wasn't really even addressing that at you. That's just an overwhelmingly common sentiment I see when people are talking about Berserk and why they haven't checked out Berserk. Because for many people, they're just not drawn to that. Like, that's just an automatic turnoff, knowing that that stuff is there. And to that point, I say that's fair. But if you do have a capacity to enjoy drama in its full spectrum, and you might be willing to deal with that stuff if it's in service of a good drama, then by all means, please check out Berserk. It changed my life in many ways and how I consume media and fiction in general. It shaped my tastes in anime, and it really gave me a good litmus to understanding what the best is. And really reflecting on that lately, it's made me consider what we've lost with Kentaro Miura. I've always loved his deep capacity for emotional storytelling, and really, that's kind of what I wanted to say, and I guess that's where I'll leave that. Did you guys have any parting thoughts on that?
Yeah. Once again, I absolutely share your sentiment. I think we've lost one of the all-time greats. And, you know, sadly, the story is left unfinished, you know, until further notice. But whatever they do decide to do with the rest of the story, if anything at all, I mean, there's a hole that's left in my heart with what he's left behind. You know, we'll never get to see his vision of how the story would have ended, but that's the sign of something that's made an undeniable and great impact on me. So once again, I find the series very irreplaceable, and I'm eternally grateful.
Okay. Yeah, I personally hope, I mean, even if he did leave meticulous notes behind, I kind of hope they just leave it as is, because I feel like ultimately he said what he's wanted to say with that series. It is super unfortunate that it will never be finished proper, but I think he's inseparable from what that series is. But that's just my thoughts. I was going to say, I would agree. I would have that same sentiment with Hunter x Hunter and Togashi. Oh yeah, same. Absolutely. Hopefully his health recovers and he'll be able to finish that. But if he never does, same sentiment absolutely towards that. Did you have any last thoughts, Rob?
Well, I mean, I kind of want to hold out hope that he did take those meticulous notes so that we could at least get an ending. But at the same point, I'm fence sitting here because I agree. We're never ever going to have an artist that has, you know, Kentaro's attention to detail and his impeccable line work and everything like that, and his mastercraft to be able to tell a very awesome story with Guts and Griffith and the Band of Hawk. It's just, as much as I want to hold out hope that we could get an ending to it, I'm absolutely fine with not, because I don't want anybody to tarnish his legacy, and I don't know if it's possible to do that without stepping on what he envisioned for the end of Berserk. So
right, and frankly, I could talk about this for hours, but I think it's about time we move on. Someday I do hope to speak at length about Berserk, maybe even a special, but we need to move on. So before we talk about Odd Taxi proper, I just wanted to say a couple things, get a couple housekeeping items out of the way. Again, I'm trying to get the show submitted to Apple Podcasts, but the technical difficulties persist. I do have a support ticket up. We are working that through with support, but it's looking like it might take a bit longer to get that on Apple Podcasts. So if that's your preferred source of podcasts, I do apologize. We're working to get that up there. Rest assured. And regarding just kind of a general attitude towards certain episodes of our show, last week we covered 86, which is a very dense show. It's a very technically complex show from the storytelling perspective. There's tons of proper nouns. There's tons of characters to get out of the way. I feel they're all important to discuss for the purpose of our podcast. And really, I don't want to miss a beat on important scenes. So for certain episodes, I'm going to be taking much more of an active role in hosting, kind of spelling out what's going on in the episode. And there's going to be other episodes where we're having a much more qualitative discussion, organic discussions on the themes of what the show is and what it means to us. Really, these dense episodes that I'm talking about are really going to be most often for episodes 1 through 4 of certain shows. Nomad and To Your Eternity, we kind of were able to have much more of those qualitative back and forth discussions. But if I'm being honest, Odd Taxi is going to be another very dense discussion where I'm going to be describing a lot of the characters and scenes, because many of these details are very easy to miss on your first time viewing. So I hope to call attention to many of these details, just kind of go over these scenes, and hopefully make the show more clear to most of our listeners and shed light on some things you may have missed the first time around. But with that said, let's get into the episode discussion. But before that, very quickly, what was you guys' impression on Odd Taxi going into it? Real quick.
Really? The only person I had noticed mention this show or shouted out to such a great length is actually Jeff from Mother's Basement. To my knowledge, no one else had really been bringing the show to light or discussing it that much, but I think he was one of the few people really advocating for people to check it out. And I'm very grateful because there's lots to discuss and lots to kind of chew on with this series. So prior to this, I hadn't heard of it. I mean, it's an anime original, and from what I've seen on my anime list, not very many credits to the people working on the show from other prior series. So really going into it as blind as possible.
Same here. Yeah. Jeff literally is the only person in the community that is given it any sort of like coverage, like you need to watch this. And, you know, with his spring anime series to watch or keep an eye out on, he did mention it, and it piqued my curiosity. I mean, I'm not really one for the anamorphic or, you know, side of things, but did end up really enjoying Beastars, which he also recommended. So I was like, all right, I'll give it a shot. And there's a lot to digest. Like, I have indigestion at this point for this show. And I'm not saying that in like a bad way. I'm saying that like, yo, we just went to a 5-star restaurant where you need to be suited up and you just gorged yourself silly on lobster. And you're sitting there like, tomorrow's going to be rough. And that's how I feel about this show. And like I said, I'm not trying to paint this in a bad light, because absolutely not. This is not a bad light that I'm trying to paint the show in, but there's just a lot to look into, a lot of subtleties and a lot of dialogue. I mean, it's like a Mass Effect dialogue option for the first 2 games. There's a lot to look into, a lot to discuss. So I'm eager to try to sell this show to our audience here, because it's very worth your time investment just with the way that the dialogue itself plays out. Like, I get Tarantino vibes from the dialogue. It will behoove you to pay attention. What about you, Sean?
Yeah, I've kind of seen that sentiment echoed elsewhere. I can't put my finger on it, but I have heard that people said Tarantino. I don't know if I quite agree with that. I think what they mean to say is the dialogue's organic. It's very off the cuff. It's very naturalistic, and I do appreciate it for that. Really, what I want to say about this series, my initial impressions, there's like a curse, with me anyways. I personally have never liked this anthropomorphized animals are suddenly humans aesthetic. I really have never liked that. But time and again, we keep getting really good media that just happens to have that. I'm kind of diametrically opposed to that aesthetic. But I love Agretzko, and I love Beastars. And many people call them furry shows. Maybe I could see that with Beastars, but really they're both great shows. I mean, Beastars is way better than Agretzko, but the point stands. And so this, once again, I kind of have this irrational aversion to Odd Taxi because of its aesthetic. But to its credit, it's a little less cutesy than Agretzko, but it's a little more exaggerated than Beastars and how it designs its characters, I guess. I definitely dig the aesthetic more in Odd Taxi if I had to compare it to those two shows.
Well, and let's be honest, if it wasn't for the aesthetic, it'd be a lot more depressing.
And frankly, I think it'd be harder to distinguish certain characters.
For sure.
One of the most common complaints, for example, in a show like Durarara, that has a similar amount of moving parts and characters, many people had a hard time following what was going on simply because there's only so many ways you can design a cast of 30 different characters with a similar art style, if you know what I mean. It's much easier when you can just code them through whatever animal they are, you know. But I digress a bit. I do have more opening impressions. To me, this is a very Japanese show, like very distinctly Japanese. Me, as someone who's lived in Japan is one of the only remaining markets in like very developed economies that still relies on taxis to the extent it does. Most countries, you know, they have Uber at this point or other third party, you know, like services and apps. But Japan, Uber's barred. They still have a very strong taxi union. But to not get too deep in the hole, as someone who lived in Nagoya for a year, living and working in Japan, you're inevitably going to use the services of a taxi. And I do think the main character, he is kind of different from the ideal of what I have as a taxi driver in Japan, because my experience of taxi drivers in Japan, most of them are dressed up in suits with like white gloves, and they look very, very much
almost like limo drivers.
Yeah. They look like chauffeurs most of the time. And so seeing Odakawa, and to my knowledge, most taxi drivers, like in the West, are free agents working under like a franchise themselves out to a taxi union or whatever. But he's not adopting that appearance. We can tell from the get-go that Odakawa is kind of hard-boiled, so to speak. Yeah. So really, I guess that's just kind of my initial impressions. I loved watching this. It really brought me back to my time in Japan. And I guess my final initial impression is this is a very noir show. It's kind of a very cynical, hard edge to the show. It's full of that naturalistic dialogue. I don't know if it's really just Odakawa that's really giving me that feel that lends into that line of thinking. But yeah, I definitely get noir vibes from this show. And I love it. Like, the first episode immediately sold me on this show. But with that, let's get into the discussion because we're way behind at this point. So the opening scene, we see a shot of a weighted body kind of descending the depths. And the way I interpreted it was it's a dream of the main character, Hiroshi Odakawa, who I'll just be referring to from now on as Odakawa. And we have a radio saying, right after this, he's in his taxi. On the radio, he hears that a high school student may have been kidnapped. And then he kind of turns it to the comedy show he likes. And then it kind of transitions into kind of a longer sequence of him listening to this comedy show, and we kind of have a dour mood as it shifts into idle music playing. The tone's
it's a weird juxtaposition, right?
Yeah. And it kind of shifts, the camera kind of shifts to a crowd of people, you know, in the street with this poppy idle music. And here we see a lot of key players in the story that will be coming up. And we'll get over who those are. But I really want to call attention to two characters in this montage, because really it surprised me on my second viewing. These characters being Shirakawa, the alpaca, and Dobu. Did you guys notice this?
Their chance meeting? Yeah. Definitely noticed that, even like on chance, quote unquote, on my first viewing. Yeah, I definitely saw that, and I was immediately skeptical. And as we progress throughout this episode, and episode 2, I'm starting to really call into question some motives for some characters, and I don't really want to go into that right now. But I certainly noticed it. What about you, Zach?
I did not. It completely passed me over until my second viewing.
Oh, yes. Yeah. During that montage of kind of the key players in this story, you have no context for who these people are, what they're doing. But on the second viewing, I'm like, oh, wait, we see Shirakawa, the alpaca, having a conversation with Dobu, this mandrill, in this alleyway. And on the second viewing, with me knowing who these characters are up through episode 4, because I don't believe any of us have seen past episode 4 at this point, but still,
nope.
That says a lot.
It gives it gives a lot of context.
That
it
colors,
really does.
It colors so much of what comes after, and really it does call into question many different things. But moving on, we see Odokawa's first customer, whose name is Kabasawa Taichi, who I'll just be referring to as Kabasawa. I'll be referring to most people in their surnames from here on. So he's like a hippo, and he enters the taxi and asks Odokawa, has anything interesting happened to you lately? And Odokawa's like, well, normally I have 5 typical answers at any given point. He asks, like, why the hell do you want to know? And he's like, well, I want to go viral. It's good for social credit, and, it can help me find jobs. And Odokawa's like, this is gross and vain.
I do kind of want to interject. I think that's interesting that, and this is something that I didn't even really know about Japanese culture, that if you have like a positive social media presence, that actually reflects on your potential for recruiters for jobs, which is just, man, are we living in 1984?
I mean,
this is Orwellian society?
That's true to some extent, even in the West. It really depends on the industry you want to get into. Based on a later scene, it seems like this character wants to specifically get into the influencer industry.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's more important to him. Really, I don't know how important that is to Japanese society at large. I would be willing to say, though, it is more important in general, though. But so he says he wants to go viral. Odokawa's like, that's kind of gross, whatever, I'm not interested. And Kabasawa's like, oh, come on, man. And then he just kind of takes a selfie with him. And he tweets a fabricated story, like, I was having a hard time finding a job. And this taxi driver's like, well, here, take this shot or whatever. I can't remember the exact context, but what do you know? It goes viral. And this is Kabasawa's first big viral tweet, I guess. So any thoughts on just kind of this opening sequence from you guys?
I can't say that it necessarily resonates with me, but I understand, at least here in the West, about how important, social media presence is. It does very much resonate, and it's just, I don't know, color me an old jaded person at this point, but I don't really subscribe to the Twitter or Facebook. If I could delete my Facebook if I didn't have the crippling addiction that, Kabasawa has to just seeing, what's everyone mad about today, and, just scrolling that feed and seeing what there is to be pissed off about.
I do think
I agree.
It's a matter of, I think, your age of influence, because those of us who are younger and grew up with social media and technology as a given and an established presence, I think it does resonate with a younger audience a lot more. And thing is, I'm definitely younger by all standards, so I could see how Kabasawa stakes a lot of credibility in how popular or viral you are as an influencer. And this is a guy who, look at me talking. I embody what's known as a lurker on the internet. I don't use hardly any social media at all, but I'll follow people. I'll see what they do. But although I don't place a lot of personal importance or, my identity as a person and self-worth is not staked in social media. But to those who are maybe in middle school or high school, growing up in this day and age, I can definitely see that being very influential and being a huge part of the lives of those growing up nowadays. So I could definitely see where Kabasawa was coming from.
Yeah, I mean, in my own words, I see it as the Zoomer spirit. You're conditioned from a young age to have this value and see it as important. Me and Rob, definitely the resident millennials of this podcast. Yeah, I never saw it as being that important growing up. I mean, because really we mostly didn't have it growing up. but you've had it from very early adolescence, so it makes much more sense from that context. Next, we see Otokawa runs into a couple of cops. So we come to find out they're brothers. They're named the Diamond Brothers, Kenshiro and Koshiro. And he's questioned by them if you've seen Dobu, a local yakuza, the aforementioned mandrill. And he shows, specifically Kenshiro, he shows a picture to Otokawa, and he said, "Your friends, aren't you?" So this implies a past history with Otokawa. So Otokawa seems to know who these guys are. And Otokawa, he's asked by Kenshiro, "Why did you become a taxi driver?" And this is where we kind of see cryptic silhouettes set to a red backdrop. To me, a clearly tragic backstory. And yeah, I thought this was an interesting little scene, and we'll definitely see more of that. But this is where Otokawa drops Kabasawa off, and he's like, don't forget your stuff. So Otokawa gets a call from Kabasawa on the phone that he, of course, left behind, telling him that he forgot it. But he's like, well, why don't you check my phone, see how my post went? And, of course, it goes viral. But, crucially, Otokawa notices Dobu, the aforementioned mandrill, the Yakuza guy, in the background. It's unclear to me at this point whether Otokawa knows Dobu, but he definitely knows Kenshiro from the Diamond Brothers, so that's of note. So, next we have a scene with Otokawa in his house. There's a news report, once again, talking about the missing high schooler from Nerima City on the TV. And this is where Otokawa's kind of talking to his closet. And we can infer pretty clearly that this is the missing high schooler. And he says, "Why did you come to my place? Are you hungry?" No response. And he tells her his day's plans and that she can run away at any time. It's all of her own free will. And then he kind of leaves. And this is where he goes to the clinic and he meets Goriki, who's a gorilla, clearly, and Shirakawa Miho, who is the aforementioned alpaca at the beginning of the episode. So we kind of have a longer dialogue sequence. What you said is a Tarantino dialogue sequence earlier. To me, I could see it in this scene where he's having a conversation with Goriki, his physician, and we learn that he's there because Otokawa has sleep problems. And he told Goriki that he's listening to Rakugo to help with sleep. If you don't know what Rakugo is, just look it up because I don't have time at this point. But so he's listening to Rakugo, trying to go to sleep, and Shirakawa reveals that she has an eraser of the Rakugo master Donraku, which is the person that Otokawa is listening to. And he remarks something like, well, who the hell needs something like that? And she's like, well, apparently there's only one of them in the world. And she gives it to Otokawa. So he reveals he listens to the recordings via cassette tapes. And this is where Godokiri makes a good joke about the younger generation doesn't know what they are. But Otokawa says, cut the generational gap crap. And Godokiri says, well, man, you're so stiff. Just get married already. And, this is kind of where they have a spirited conversation about Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, yeah, easily the highlight, in my opinion.
And he's like, well, you're drunk on the name of Bruce Springsteen, aren't you? And yeah, this is just a dumb banter sequence that kind of comes to characterize this show.
It's my favorite part of the
love
episode.
it.
It's stupid, but I love it.
Yeah.
Well, it's very harken back to me that, like, I always like to headcanon Goriki as Kondo-san from Gintama, and having him have this dumb dialogue is just so reminiscent of Kondo-san. Like, headcanon, every time, like, Goriki is there, I'm just like, that's Kondo-san.
Yeah, I can see the association, but yeah, so Goriki says, you should just get married, but I'll prescribe you stronger medication. We'll just leave it at that. So this is where Otokawa comes outside to find Kenshiro, the older of the
Diamond Brothers.
Right, the Diamond Brothers. So he's out there, he's looking into his taxi, And he says that they, as in the police, has info linking Odokawa to the disappearance of the girl. So they're on to him, it seems. And he tells Odokawa to cooperate with the investigation, and I say that in air quotes, to avoid suspicion. And he requests recordings of the dash cam, and we learn from Odokawa that it's up to 2 weeks of recording. So Kenshiro takes the SD card. He threatens him to not go to the police. If he does, he says a criminal with a gun would come for him. So he's clearly in bed with some sort of criminal element here.
Mm-hmm.
So Goriki, the physician, goes to a local small izakaya, and there we meet Kakihana Eiji, who I'll be referring to as Kakihana. So he changes his Tinder profile, and I'm talking about Kakihana here. I'm just going to say Tinder profile, to having a much higher annual income than, let's say, what he has. And Goriki tells him that he wants Odokawa to go to a larger hospital for treatment as he's concerned about his condition. And we can infer, obviously, that they all know who Odokawa is here.
Right, and everybody says that he's kind of strange.
Yeah. And we learn that he hates people, he's sarcastic, and that his parents abandoned him. So that's definitely interesting. And the owner of the izakaya, Harada Taiko, she tells them about Dobu, the mandrill character, after saying that she heard about him from a police investigation, how dangerous he is. I don't know exactly how she came across that information, but she kind of gives a little expository dialogue behind this character. So after some continued banter, we see that Goriki receives a call from one of his employees and notes missing medicine. More went missing, psychotropic drugs, about 6,000 pills, which is a hefty amount of missing drugs, let's say. So, any thoughts from you guys on this last sequence?
So, this kind of harkens back to Shirakawa meeting with who we now know as Dobu at the beginning of the episode and giving him something. I'm pressing F to doubt here, boys. F to doubt about her intentions. What about you, Zach?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I had completely missed like our first interactions with these characters, like just through episode 1. But yeah, the sus alarm is going off like loud and clear with some of these events. Like, I think this was the very first instance when we heard that this exorbitant amount of medicine has gone missing. I'm like, oh, we have a laundering problem. Okay.
6K is a butt fuckload of pills to be missing.
And who other but the Yakuza could make use of selling drugs, am I right?
Right.
To move things along because we are behind, but definitely have more to say on Shirakawa going forward. Do take note, though, psychotropic drugs. Please take note of that. I'm sure that will come into play at some point. If you see a scene where everything's coming into doubt and everything gets crazy, take that into consideration, because that's my guess. Moving along, let's get to Shirakawa. She gets into Odokawa's taxi. She's saying that she remembers him, obviously, because just earlier in the day he was at the clinic. And he remarks that he's the only alpaca around here. Again, that's another seemingly throwaway remark, but I'm sure that will be important later, because he takes note. She's the only alpaca around here. We really can't mistake that person at the beginning of the episode for anyone else, the one talking to Dobu. So this prompts her to laugh. He doesn't understand what young people are thinking nowadays, which kind of illustrates an age gap between them. And where she responds...
just for context, Odokawa is 41 and Shirakawa, I think, is like 28.
Yep, that's right. And she says, cut the generation gap crap, kind of calling back to what he said earlier with his conversation to Goriki. So the shot shifts to Dobu walking by in the rain as the taxi drives away, just kind of showing his presence over all the events that have preceded in this episode. And specifically, he discreetly trades a note to the Diamond Brother Kenshiro in the rain. So Kenshiro trades the dash cam recording, and Dobu trades a note showing that they're in cahoots. Any thoughts on the episode as a whole?
Well, yeah, lots of dirty little secrets going around. Obviously, the police are corrupt here in this city. They're,
At least Kenshiro is.
right, but I mean, there's a lot of like cogs, like a lot of twists and turns and stuff going on in the background. Like,
and I
very
have so much more to say on all of that, but sorry.
No, I mean, that kind of concludes my thoughts. I don't know what you had to say, Rob.
In essence, like, my biggest thoughts about this very first episode is, despite that the way that this show is animated, you get this feeling of something far more sinister going on with the show, which is intrinsically very
curious.
Yes, very curious. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah.
What about you, Sean?
Yeah, and that's kind of why I said it has this noir feel to it. Like, just as much as it has this kind of jazzy, saxy soundtrack to it much of the time, it's very interspersed with this like poppy, idolish music. You kind of get this feeling that it's all just, it's really absurd. I do want to say, yeah, it is at times sinister, but it's often just as much playful. I think chaos is kind of what it's going for. There are definitely plot threads, though, that are extremely dark, and we'll get into that going forward. But yeah, no, I think this is an excellent introduction. This is what sold me immediately. I was fully on board by the end of the first episode. But moving on to episode 2. So we begin with a scene in a place called Equator Sauna, which will definitely be a point of recurrence. Real briefly, Kakihara, he's jealous at Odokawa due to giving Shirakawa a ride because they're, as he later puts, nearing eternal bachelorhood. They're both people like in their late 30s, early 40s who having problems, finding a relationship. We'll get back to them, but the scene right after this is a flashback of Odokawa giving Shirakawa that ride at the end of last episode. So we hear a comedy duo on the radio, and I felt the need to say directly what they're saying. The other day, I got caught up in vanity searching. I searched for Homo sapiens funny online and got hit with a storm of Homo sapiens aren't funny, and then kind of ensue a bickering between these two comedy hosts on the radio. So initially I thought, wait, are there actually like humans in this world? But really what it seems to be with later context is Homo sapiens is just the name of their show. There is no real indicator beyond that humans exist in this world. Any quick thoughts from you two on that?
That didn't even like cross my mind.
That was a funny little detail to me that I'm like, wait, is there going to be like a wild card human in the show?
Part of me was just kind of going through a mini existential like dread with like how their conversation turned.
I mean, that's a way of looking at it. Any thoughts, Rob?
Well, for me, we're going to have to kind of like harken back to episode 1 where we had that really, really brief flashback of that horrible accident that may or may not have happened at Odokawa.
That's a good point. Yep.
I didn't even get really an opportunity to talk about it, but I really think that this whole animals theme throughout all of this show is just Odokawa's psyche trying to defend himself from reality. So
like
I think
a coping mechanism.
Yeah, it's 100% a coping mechanism, and we get even that like close up with like the medicine in his dashboard. So I really think that this Homo sapien animal trope, because if you notice some of the intricacies whenever he calls like Goriki or Shirakawa like an alpaca or like a gorilla, they all kind of just like laugh it off.
Exactly.
So I think this is just all a point of view from Odokawa's perspective, which is infinitely interesting to me.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because in these sequence, I think there's 2 across these stretch of episodes with these silhouettes. They're clearly human silhouettes to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it calls to mind probably my second favorite manga, which I won't mention here because I don't want to spoil it, but it's kind of a similar framing in it regarding certain characters. So no, I'm glad you made note of that, because I was kind of thinking something similar. But again, we're behind. Moving on. So they're in the taxi. He's in the taxi with Shirakawa. This is really the first time they're speaking alone with each other. And on the comedy program, he's still listening to it. Shirakawa says, "Do you feel awkward?" Because he's spending so much time listening to this radio program when clearly she wants to talk to him. And, he's like, "Well, I'm listening to it out of habit." Then she asks why he doesn't sleep, and he says, "I've forgotten how to." They talk a lot. She knows a lot about him due to his medical files. She knows his age. But then we come to learn that Shirakawa feels regret for not relying on her parents more, and that she took out a loan to go to nursing school. But she's apparently paid it off. And in my notes, I said, "Gee, I wonder how." At this point,
another sus alert.
Right.
There's at least a few different methods at this point I can think of. So Otokawa asks, "Where were you born?" And then she sings a song from Miyazaki. So Miyazaki Prefecture is one.
Well, he asked her to sing that song and didn't expect her to
because
sing it.
Yeah, he was testing her and her sincerity, because she's like, "Well, I come from a more country prefecture." And Miyazaki is a very rural prefecture on the southernmost island of Kyushu. So it's pretty rural. And Otokawa asks if there's anyone she likes, and she says yes, and she shows a picture of him. So I went through a lot of thoughts on, well, is she being sincere, or is she playing or manipulating him? After the second viewing and reconciling everything a second time, I think she might actually be somewhat sincere despite her relationship with Dobu. I'll ask you guys for your opinion on that more a little later, but that's just kind of my perception of that, but we have to move along. So next we're back in the sauna, and Kakihara interrogates Otokawa, and he says he should pursue her. And he says, "I'm asking how big your affection is for her." And Otokawa says, "About the size of a North American supplement." So take that for what you will. Kaki asks, I'll be referring to him in short form as Kaki. He asks Otokawa if he wants to go to Taiko's place. But he says he's working tonight, and he sits down to check his app and sees a picture of Shio, an 18-year-old, waiting to meet him, talking about Kaki. The scene transitions to a bookshelf full of books on how to make a career in social media. And we see Kabisawa here, the hippo guy, pulling up a dull tweet he made about ordering a highball from a foreign-looking izakaya waiter. This only has 4 likes. He's clearly floundering in the social media game. He's wondering to himself, how do I go viral? And he pulls up another tweet from Donraku, Shofute, or the eraser dude that Shirakawa gave Otokawa in the prior episode of the clinic. So Donraku, in a tweet, is ranting about young people on their phones and not watching TV. And this has 20k likes, 2,000 comments, and 140,000 retweets. That's a hell of a ratio if I've ever heard one. And he's looking back to his popular tweet with Otokawa, and we see a clear look of resolve. And I felt this is worth mentioning because I feel like this character is a wild card going forward. He's going to bring to light something to the public. I feel like that's my feeling. But the next scene, we see this idol group that we learn is Mystery Kiss. And we see a fan who we learn his surname is Imai, getting a Polaroid pic with Nikaido, who's kind of the lead singer of this idol group. So he's kind of doting over her. He's promising to buy her single. We learn that he's kind of one of the oldest fans of this group. And the manager, Yamamoto, he kind of walks up and he's like, beat it, move on to the next. And we learn that this group, which is comprised of Nikaido, Ichimura, and Miya. He's asking 2 of them. 2 of them are in masks, and these 2 are Ichimura and Miya. He's telling them to go outside and sell the leftover merch. So these 2, Ichimura and Miya, are having a conversation outside about their life difficulties. And here we learn Ichimura likes bats, while Miya likes to eat fried foods. Just kind of establishing very basic motivations for these characters going forward. And later we see Nikaido, the lead singer, being praised by Yamamoto, the manager of the group, for her publicity. But she's disappointed in their sales given their relative popularity. And she says, we need more fans like Imai. And the manager is like, well, he's one of those 5 initial fans, right? And at that point, though, he gets a phone call. And he says to the person on the other line, it's them. It went well. Half, right? And then he mentions a dash cam. And then he says, I'll look for him. Do you know the driver's name? So this, at the time, seemed like an innocuous detail. We learn that he's connected somehow to all of this. This girl going missing. We can infer he's part of the local crime element. So next, Odokawa picks up Imai, the fan, and we see him pay only $2,000 for a ride to Shinjuku. He's stingy. Odokawa lets him off, though. He drops him off in Shinjuku. But right before dropping him off, he mentions that Odokawa probably has a lot of luck. And Odokawa recounts an accident that should have killed him. But this is another roughly drawn red sequence with red and black silhouettes. And we see 2 cops over a body in cop cars. So speaking to what you said, Rob, like a lot of shenanigans going on with the perspective of our main protagonist. Next, we see a text from Shirakawa, again, the alpaca character, and he looks at it, she's saying, do you want to meet up? But he has to pick up these 2 passengers, and we come to learn that it's a comedy duo, and they want to go to Japan Broadcasting. So he puts away the phone, he starts driving away, and we come to learn that the name of these 2 characters are Shibagaki Kensuke and Baba Atsuya. So Shibagaki, the boar character, he's watching videos on his phone for material. And he says, look, doesn't this just piss you off? And we see a 10-minute video clip of Kabasawa singing a shitty song on his YouTube channel called Sadness in the Subway. That got a good laugh out of me. But anyways, Baba's showing Shibagaki a game he's playing with more or less his full name and profile on it. He's like, well, this is for user interaction, but Shibagaki's pissed off at him, saying you should use that time to write material. And we kind of see in a sequence where Odokawa's saying he knows them from the radio when they start talking about more sensitive stuff. But really the takeaway I got from this was he's saying that they probably need more luck to be successful, but also notes that they're not equally committed. Mm-hmm. And Baba then gets a phone call from their manager showing up on a daytime food show. But ironically, it's Baba the one that gets the appearance, even when they all recognize that he's the least committed. So, and this is when Odokawa picks up his next customer at gunpoint, who we quickly learn to be Dobu. So quickly to move on, do you guys have any thoughts about this sequence or the episode as a whole?
Well, personally, coming from working in like a corporate environment, that I feel this shit because I'll put forth my own 110% effort and just get looked over by people that aren't doing shit for the team, and it's just understand that. I really do. Yeah,
we get the clear impression that Baba is younger than Shibagaki, and despite not being invested in what he's doing, having full doubt in himself, everyone realizes that he's the weaker of the 2. He's the one that ironically gets this role. And we can infer that it's probably because he's younger and more handsome and he has experience, even if it's not great experience. But your thoughts, Zach?
Not a whole lot. I think I'll have more to say about the Mystery Kiss idol group probably in later episodes, but I think for now we should probably move on to Odokawa being held at gunpoint.
But before we move on, regarding the idol group, I do want to say Shio, just to spell it out to the audience. She is the one contacting Kakihana on the app. So there's a lot of shenanigans afoot there, and that's how she's going to tie into the whole situation with Kakihana and Odokawa and how that all ties together.
And just to be real, we haven't seen her without the mask, so
yeah,
if you're kind of falling behind on it, it's understandable.
Oh yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, it took me to episode 4. It took me to episode 4 to be like, oh shit, that's okay. I see what's going on here.
Definitely. And keep that in mind as we get later into episode 3. So getting into episode 3, we're once again opening up at the Equator Sauna, but this time Kakihana is just sitting there by himself. And then a large Yakuza man, who we come to learn is Kuroda, sits near him. And then he starts, air quotes, asking for the taxi driver's name. And then he mistakes that he's talking to him. And then he starts answering all of his questions. And then Kaki asks what, you mean Odokawa? And then this big Yakuza guy proceeds to break down the story of the missing high school girl from Nerima City. Kakihana thinks the entire time he's talking to him. But the important parts in this, we learned that Kuroda is allegedly the reason she ran away, this big Yakuza guy, and requests an unknown individual to investigate her whereabouts. And that also, she's Don-chan's daughter. And it all clicked to me upon rewatch, but Don-chan. We know about Don Raku, this baboon figure who does the Rakugo and who's making these tweets about young people not watching TV. So that's who I interpret Don-chan to be. That's how I see this figure factoring into this story.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. But anyways, at the end of this exchange, he pulls out the earbud, and Kaki realizes that at the end, Kuroda was on the phone, and he just kind of gives out a big sigh of relief. The next scene, we see Odokawa driving Dobu, again, at the end of last episode, by gunpoint. We learned that Dobu was the other one on the line. We could clearly see he was very visibly nervous talking to Kuroda, implying that he knows more than he's letting on, and that he's kind of shocked to hear that she's Don-chan's daughter. So, to move things along very quickly, Dobu doesn't want anyone knowing about what Odokawa knows. He wants to know about anyone coming to Odokawa for his dashcam data. And he says he will kill Odokawa if he refuses. And this is where Odokawa secretly turns on his SOS light. Odokawa's like, fine, but I want to know what's going on so I can be selective about the details I give to people if I have to give a incomplete story, because not everyone's going to accept, I don't know. So this is where Dobu starts to divulge some details, and he says his boss wants to find the missing girl as she's the daughter of a classmate, and that the police officially suspect Dobu. And he swears to God that he's not involved, and he thinks he was framed. And he says the investigation request was withdrawn due to the info that the reason she ran was because of his boss, Kuroda, and Don-chan. And he believes that an individual called Yano set her up to the idea, and says that he's his kohai or junior, but that they hate each other, and says that anyone coming for Odokawa in his info will likely be one of Yano's lackeys. So this is where Dobu says he didn't tell his boss about the dashcam data, and Yano says that he only takes petty jobs. And this is where I was kind of confused, because I'm like, well, him getting the dashcam data, like, does that constitute as a petty job? I mean, this sounds important, but it became more apparent to me as the conversation went on why he didn't want his boss knowing about it, because this allows him to act to take down Yano. Because if his boss doesn't know that he has the dashcam data and then he was already working on this, that this allows him to take what information he has and work against taking down Yano, because if he can catch Yano red-handed in being the instigator for this entire incident, then that allows him to do that.
I think Yano's literally gambling here, trying to accrue power.
For sure.
Definitely, Odokawa does not trust Dabu, and he's gotten to the point where he's like, I don't like you, and I'm going to refuse all of your advances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And he ends up refusing to help him because he says he's a criminal and that he knows his pride won't allow him to kill Odokawa. And this is where he's pulled over because of the SOS signal on the top of his taxi. But, of course, who other than Kenshiro, the Diamond Brothers, pulls him over and basically gives Dobu his get out of jail free card. He's like, your SOS sign's distracting. You should turn that off. Have a nice day. And this is Dobu's lucky break because, they're in obvious cahoots with one another.
Odokawa tattled like he's straight up trying to snitch.
Yeah, I mean, but it makes sense in this situation because...
Well, we got that really cool scene where, Dobu is like, is this the older brother or is it the younger brother?
Yeah.
So kind of like a really intense scene, which was really well directed. I like.
And I could keep speaking on about it, but the thing of import from this scene I want to mention, because it's a very small detail, when Kenshiro gets back in his cop car and he's done talking to his brother, he recalls a brief memory about a cryptic crash scene with a body in the street. And it kind of correlates with that brief scene with Otokawa from the prior scene describing the accident. But anyways, Otokawa reveals he's not afraid of dying. Dobu recognizes that death threats doesn't give him leverage. Money doesn't matter to him. So he starts thinking about who to threaten, who's important to him. Kakihana, Otokawa's like, well, he's probably better off dead. That kind of got a chuckle from me.
Shitty. That's kind of shitty, but yeah.
Yeah. But no, then he comes across Shirakawa, and this visibly upsets him because he's looking through his phone. This works, and then we see the dashboard cam cut at this point. So, very long sequence. Any brief thoughts about this since we're running behind?
So he definitely centered in about Otokawa's feelings towards Shirakawa. I think that he definitely picked up on him caring for her more than Otokawa would ever want to put forward. Yeah, disclose. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of gathered from that as well. He's pretty much just trying to get any leverage on him to do what he wants and to have his way with him basically not spilling the beans. Because as we can gather now, Otokawa has many connections with many people, even though he would rather not have it. It's kind of a misfortune in a way. But again, I think that plays into the theme of quote unquote luck and him having a lot of it, and maybe for the wrong reasons.
And I'm glad you mentioned those connections, because when Kenshiro gets in the car and remembers that accident or that crash, we wonder why Otokawa and Kenshiro seem to know each other. And this is the scene that comes to Kenshiro's mind when thinking about Otokawa from the past. So that's definitely something to keep of note. But next, we see it's 4:14 a.m. and Otokawa sees the text and races to the park. So he nearly hits a crying individual on the way there who will become important later. And the next scene, this is where we find Otokawa meeting up with Shirakawa at the park. She's still waiting for him. And this is where he says to her, you don't want to be friends with me. And he kind of discloses the whole Yakuza situation and how being associated with him is dangerous. And then she says, well, I used to practice capoeira. I don't know how you say it, but capoeira. And she does the stance to music that I recognized when I actually saw it. But
Eddie from Tekken.
Yeah. And Otokawa, surprised, says, I thought a Bollywood movie was about to start. But he says in this moment that he calls it makeshift because she reveals that she learned it due to exercise and weight loss, but then she started practicing it more for, the actual martial benefit. But he still calls it makeshift. This upsets her. It's a nice scene. But anyways, Otokawa tells her again it's dangerous for them to meet, and that she says she doesn't care and that she can take care of herself, and that she finds being around him to be relaxing. Really, I guess you could take it either way, whether she's being sincere in this moment. The way she's framed in this moment, it really does feel like she has genuine concern on her face. It doesn't seem forced on her part. However, I guess the only thing I'll call into question is most people would not wait until 4 a.m., several hours sitting in the park to meet.
Seems kind of sketch to me.
Yeah. I'll respect either interpretation, but it's difficult for me to decide one way or the other. Next, we see a segment with Baba, the comedian, one of the duo, kind of on a TV nervously asking pedestrians, what's for lunch? On what we come to see as Taiko's TV screen, the izakaya owner. And this is where Kakihana, he's in the izakaya, and he's with Otokawa, and they're talking about their women that they're interested in. And real quickly, Kakihana is like, how are you feeling about Shirakawa? And he's like, well, it's the size of Jupiter now. Like, he's really starting to fall for her.
Yep.
And then Kaki and him are bickering about the nature of love when he shows Otokawa his match on this stand-in for Tinder. And again, we see it's with Shio, who we know now is part of that idol group. And Otokawa says, she's just a little girl. And Otakawa's highly skeptical. He's like, you're getting scammed, dude. And then he wrests the phone from him and notices that he put 20 million yen annual income, which is about $180,000 a year. He's like, this kind of supersedes every other aspect of your profile. And he's like, I just want to dream, man. And then Otakawa is like, well, I can't argue with that, and just lets it be. So this is where he meets up afterwards. Kaki meets up with Shio at a bus stop in the rain, drunken.
Very drunk.
In the rain. And she mentions, well, you're even more wonderful than I had thought. I'm relieved. And I'm like, yeah, right. And they talk about where to go. And after briefly talking, she's like, to where to find tea, because we have to remember she's still not of age to drink yet, because in Japan it's 20 years old. So she mentions, well, there's a Doder nearby. Let's go there. And for those of you who probably don't know, Doder is kind of like a Dunkin' Donuts in Japan. So she's like, let's just go there. And we notice behind them her manager, Yamamoto, and another rough-looking type are following closely behind. And my guess is, well, in idol culture, having relations are a big no-no. So for whatever reason, either they're in on a scam that she's the bait for, or they have reason to believe that she's pursuing a relationship, which again is a no-no in idol culture. So I see it as one or the other. What are you guys' thoughts on this?
I mean, I shared the exact same feelings. I'm like, yeah, this is kind of a commentary on idol culture in Japan, and relationships are like very discouraged by all accounts. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you pretty much said everything I was about to say.
Yeah, basically my take on it is literally I just learned about idol culture this past week and a half. Yeah, I'm getting the same kind of scam about it, and
it could really be one way or the other as far as I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and it really could be. It really, really could be, but the way that this show is presenting itself, I'm not gonna get my hopes up high.
So my final thoughts on this episode, it may be a third thing. So Yamamoto, their manager, is clearly in with the local crime syndicate. Yano is mentioned as a known quantity. I think personally that Yamamoto is under Yano and not Dobu or his boss. I think he is under Yano, and since Otakawa is a known quantity at this point between all the crime parties, I think they're using his connections to get close to him. So they're trailing her because they know she somehow has a relationship with one of Otakawa's friends, and they're going to use his friend to get to Otakawa.
Yep.
That's another potential scenario I see. But with that, we need to get to the next episode because we're woefully behind. So with that, let's get to episode 4.
There's so much to discuss.
It's so much.
We're not doing justice. Anybody that is listening, we are not doing justice for this show because, I mean, we could go on 3-4 hours about this show.
Yeah, on this mere stretch. But yeah, we need to move on. So
we could do 4 hours for 4 episodes, literally.
All right, so episode 4, we have an opening with who we come to learn his name is Tanaka Hajime. So he's running frantically down the street, looks really haggard, is filthy, looks kind of almost crazy. And we get the narrated voice. Our story begins 4 years ago, so this is his voice. And he says he started working at a game company and that he's working on newer free-to-play games, but prefers older ones, saying that friends give an advantage just since time and money do, and that he says games should be an escape from reality because he sees those things as real life infringing on the games he loves. So this kind of gives him a further flashback to his childhood where there's an eraser collecting fad in his 3rd year of grade school. And the reason for this was apparently the teacher had a big issue with wealth gaps in the hobbies these kids had and wanted students to not deviate from the average. But their loophole in this was stationery, thus erasers. So quickly, what did you all think of this?
I think it's a very relatable dynamic because all of us, going to public school at some point in time, or I went to a private school, but these kind of dynamics are natural, especially when there's some form of like opposition from a higher power or whatever, like, because they notice, like teachers and stuff, they'll notice what kind of leverage they can use against you, and it's always something you like. So naturally, with these kids using stationery as sort of, like you said, it's basically a fad, but it's something that they all can equally partake in. So I thought it was very fitting.
Yeah, I think it's easy to scoff at the teacher for being a stiff, but I think back to my early childhood, kind of around that age, and I remember there being a lot of issues and fights and stuff around hobbies like this. For example, what comes to my mind is like Pokemon cards. That caused all sorts of drama in elementary school, like you wouldn't believe. So I can kind of see what he's getting at.
Yeah, shitty trades.
Yeah,
rivalries and everything about
who
had the best holographic. Yeah, that was certainly my experience too. So it's very relatable.
Yeah, and Tanaka, to kind of bring this into the greater story he's trying to tell, for him, this was all about hierarchy. He's talking about the smart kids, the
jocks.
Yeah,
pretty kids.
Yes. Kids with all of these qualities to them that made them high up in their little hierarchy. But he said for those of us who had none of these things, we just had this hobby. And he said he was one of two that were basically serious about it. And the other one he said was Sato. And he said his parents constantly went overseas, so they were able to get these rare erasers, and he had an allowance. But for Tanaka, his prize eraser was his dodo, which apparently was extremely rare. We don't know what it's from or anything, but we know he really liked birds and that he was really fixated on the dodo, not just the eraser, but just the idea of the dodo being kind of an extinct, unique bird. So this kind of led him to begging for a gray male cockatiel that he later would name Maru. He said his brother received expensive otaku computer games while he just got this bird. But he said, well, it's cheap by comparison, So his dad, to make him shut up, he just gets him this bird. So
we've all been there. I want that Lego set.
Yeah.
Shut up, I'll buy you the Lego set.
To this day, I remember not getting Batman Arkham Asylum, and that was the most devastating birthday of my life. That's all I wanted.
Yeah. So, yeah, because his budget and opportunities for rare racers were much lower, he was really desperate to come across a super rare eraser, which led him to the one-of-a-kind super rare original Donraku eraser. Notice that name coming up yet again, Donraku. And if you're paying attention, it's the same eraser that Shirakawa gave Odakawa at the beginning. And I'm sure that won't lead to shit later on.
Right, and Donraku might be short for Don-chan.
Exactly. So he became obsessed with possessing it on this kind of like eBay website. It's an auction website. Going so far as sneaking into his parents' room at night to record his father's credit card number. I do like he makes the note of the credit card being anyone could acquire, so it's like a kind of a starter card.
Even students could use it, was his quote.
So, which caused him to be sentimental, but that's another story, which was interesting to me. So we see him continuously in this bidding war until it reaches a fever pitch. The auction's about to end, and right at the last second, his father's home. He's coming up the stairs, and in a panic,
his brother, I think.
Yeah, you're actually right. It's his brother, and he was about to hit it for 10,000 yen, which would be about $100. But then he went super panic mode and added another zero, which is basically $1,000, and It's a little understandable why his father gets so angry. I mean, never excuses the physical abuse, but yeah, that's a lot of money, especially on a starter card where you're probably going well over the limit. But
Right.
anyways, 1 week passed, then a month passed. His eraser did not arrive, and his childlike understanding of no refunds, no returns kept him from really acting on or disputing the transaction. So this really had an impression on him. He kind of had to interrogate with himself while he was getting beat by his dad. Whose fault is this? And ultimately, he came to the realization it's my fault. I'm the one at fault for this. So before we go back to the present, do you guys have any last thoughts on his childhood?
At least he realizes it's his fault, so
True.
it's kind of a rough scene. Like Dad did kick the shit out of him, and it's just kind of frustrating from my point of view because, like, I understand credit card rights and consumer advocacy and shit like that, and it's just like it wasn't even thought of to do, which most certainly a cultural difference. But goddamn.
Yeah, I think what stuck out to me is he began this whole flashback trying to get this eraser, dubbing it Tanaka's Revolution.
Yeah.
Kind of trying to paint it in a more extravagant light that affected the school at large, when really he's the only one who's been affected by this, who cares about it. And at the end of it, he even comes to terms like he knows it's his fault. But
this is really the first sign we get that this kid's a narcissist. Like, he's deeply introspective on one hand. He's generally able to acknowledge his faults and see the bigger picture on things, but he will not let go of the idea of self-embellishment and what we later come to see as sort of his idea on destiny, and he will not let go of it. So flash back to the present, to air quotes 4 years ago. He's once again saying games are meant to be played alone, battling against the developer. He really doesn't like the idea of these social games. And in Japan, it's very popular to have these free-to-play social and very often gacha-like games. So he comes across this game, though. We can infer that it's probably job-related, that he's looking at all these games. And he sees a game called Zoological Garden, or aka Zuden. And he begins playing it for free. He attributes his affinity for it from the time he collected erasers. And that's because one of the rarest, perhaps the rarest unit in the game he can acquire is the dodo. And he says it's from the free gacha in it. And me and Zach, being Fate Go players, I think I know what you would think the equivalent for that is. So eventually he caves, he loses restraint, and he spends 500 yen on the paid gacha. And then he begins to become obsessed with rank. And then he starts looking at other players, and then he sees the top player is Ditch 11, who earlier in the episode we know is the same person who scammed him out of that money on the eraser, because of course he never actually got that eraser, but also named Ditch 11. So this is another part where his narcissism starts to surface, and he sees it as a direct connection to him. He starts to see it as destiny at work. So it would be my present self who would save my past self, is what he says. And he added 100,000 yen, or about $1,000. And this is where his downward spiral truly begins. Any quick thoughts on this?
Well, I think after we see what results of, the beginnings of the spiral, I think I'll save my thoughts for what the inevitable, eventuality of all, gacha players come across.
Yeah.
It's called gacha for a reason, right? So eventually, if you get invested enough into it, it's going to get you.
Yeah. So flash forward back to the present. He's still playing Zuden, and he's looking way worse for the wear. He says, in total, I've spent over 5 million yen on this game.
Which is about 46,000 USD.
Yep. So over the course of 4 years, he spent almost a year's salary on this game. Roughly. Assuming that's probably around his salary, but who knows. He says his rank is only in the triple digits. he still doesn't have the dodo. So again, going off the analogy me and Zach knows, that's kind of understandable. You could probably go that long without getting that character.
Yep.
But it's really affecting his life in every way. He's zoning out during meetings to check the game. He's utterly obsessed with getting the dodo. So he makes a note that an account with a dodo could be mined for several tens of thousands of yen, but that's not it. To me, it's not the same. And actually, me being someone who's played a lot of gacha, I can actually kind of understand his mindset, because at that point, it's not yours.
Yep. It's not valid unless you're the one who pulls it and
yes,
you got the luck.
Exactly. It's terrible that I can understand the feeling of what he's saying, even though it's completely irrational and bullshit. But anyways, he says he attributes it to a sickness. Again, despite being a narcissist, he is introspective. So
he's very self-aware.
To an extent. And he says to get revenge on the boy I was 16 years ago and save him, once again, he's trying to retroactively frame this as saving himself, and to get closer to Ditch 11 as being the reasons why he needs to be the one to pull it and not just simply buy it from, just buy another account and make it his. So he says he finally pulls the dodo, or rather, we see the scene of him finally pulling the dodo, and we actually saw it last episode when Otakawa was rushing to see Shirakawa at the park, and he avoids getting run over, but he drops the phone into like a drainage ditch, and he tries to get the data recovered at a repair shop, but the dodo shows up as missing in the game. It did not save when he actually pulled it. So that's where he says, my mind went blank. I couldn't think. I don't remember walking home. And he also finds that his bird of 16 years has also just passed away. And this is when he really just kind of has a psychotic break, and he's reasoning to himself on the nature of God and fate. And he utters, "Hey God, it's you," when he finds the buried revolver that Dobu buried in the prior episode in the park. And he says this happened 3 days ago. So this is when he's kind of uttering to himself, taxi, kill, Maru, Dodo. He's just completely dissociated. He's psychotic at this point. He's lost all semblance of normal reality. He bumps into Shibagaki, the boar character from the comedy duo. He asks for an apology, but he stares at him like a madman. I liked how they characterized Shibagaki here. Like, he's concerned about this stranger, but this is where Tanaka says, after, Shibagaki says why he came to Tokyo, he mentions luck. And of course, Otakawa is the one that began that idea of luck to Shibagaki in the episodes prior. And Tanaka says, so you're saying the dodo is unlucky then? And he walks away. And this is when he says to himself, he's always been seeking something that he was lacking, but he's come to a new realization. And to me, my understanding is that all-encompassing realization is to kill Otakawa, who took his dodo from him.
His next line of direct pleasure, that dopamine hit. Yeah,
and like I feel like they read up on some serial killers, because many serial killers have this like psychotic break, this like realization that inspires them to do what they do. I don't know. What did you all think of this? He did actually see his license plate number, even though he didn't catch him.
So, Rob, you go first. I have some extended thoughts about this.
Well, no, like I said, like he had that break. It's literally the lowest of his low, and it was kind of tough to see him go through that, because I think, out of the three of us, we spent a lot of money on microtransactions in games. It's definitely kind of difficult to see, but the downroad, I mean, fuck, man, his bird died on that same day. Like, what a shitty day. He lost 2 birds.
Yep.
And I could see in his state of mind trying to bury his, like, one and only friend/family member, and finding that gun, like, that's serendipity. At that point, he's like, yep, this was meant to be. So
yeah, he sees fate in it, even though throughout most of his life, this is not fate dictating what's happening to him. He's actively creating these situations. He's not seeing that he's misconstruing as fate.
Yep.
Yeah, it's largely a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, these coincidences at the end of this episode really push him over the edge. So what did you think, Zach?
So just relating this to a personal story, unfortunately, my crippling addiction to Fate Go, I remember a scenario where it was a pretty like a rough period of my life, and I could just reliably play the game to take my mind off things. And of course, the one time that the North American server has like a sporadic random crash happened when I pulled the gacha one time and got 3 5-star craft essences.
What?
And one of them was that?
No, go ahead.
And so I pulled 3 5-star craft essences, which, I mean, I think it's a 4% chance just for one, let alone 3.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was a kaleidoscope, which is easily one of the best. And this was not the story banner. This was a limited banner. And of course, the server crashes, which is like a blue moon, once in a blue moon event. And of course, everything's lost.
That's never happened to me. I didn't know that happened to you.
That event compounded by just real life, just all around shitty events. Although on a very mild comparison, in regards to like what Tanaka's going through, part of me gets it. You just feel like you're just fated to, no pun intended, but yeah, it's like fate where you think nothing else could go wrong, but it happens, and you feel like God or someone somewhere out there is trying their hardest to give you the most worst luck imaginable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, really, I love this episode. It's the most unique one yet. A very personal look at one character, but it's very important understanding the mindset of this character. And I think it's safe to say we're going to be seeing a lot more of Tanaka. And my guess is some of the most intense, pivotal moments in this series will probably be instigated by him.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, my favorite episode by far so far. I'm really looking forward to it.
It's pretty much my de facto favorite episode right now, just because of how unique it is, how holistic it is, and really just, you don't see stories like this in anime that much outside of, well, I'll discuss that another day, but I think we're about out of time. Any final thoughts on these first 4 episodes in general? Or
I'm really eager to see what's next.
Same, man. If we definitely could not have done this show justice even if we had 2 hours, but man, if anything that we said has piqued your curiosity, it's worth the viewing. Like this is a great show so far.
Definitely. I can't remember the last time I saw an anime like this at the very least. Yeah, I guess I mentioned Durarara a little bit ago, but it's probably the closest thing I can think of where it's just all of these chaotic threads kind of coming together in the end. However, this is much more focused and cohesive and made specifically for the medium. It's not a light novel adaptation. So, obviously, if I had to recommend one or the other, I would recommend this every day of the week. So, yes, please check out this show. But with that, I think we're out of time. To wrap things up, be sure to tune in next week for our discussion on episodes 5 through 9 of Megalobox Nomad. Feel free to give us a follow on our Twitter at 444pod, all 4s numerical, to receive any news or updates regarding the podcast. You can also feel free to email us at 444podc@gmail.com. Again, all 4s numerical, pod letters C@gmail.com, with any questions you would like featured on a future episode. So with that, thank you for joining us today. We hope you all have a great week, and join us next time as we discuss Megalobox Nomad episodes 5 through 8. Have a good one, everyone.
Take care.
Deuces.